This video was a follow-up to the video I posted yesterday where I talk about the benefits of allowing people to have false beliefs in terms of doctrine. So if you haven't watched that video, you really should watch that one first. It's only 5 minutes. I'll link it below. This is a follow-up to that, answering some questions and objections that were raised in response to it. First of all, someone commented, well, this reflection appears to be that the end justifies the means. If you want to put it that way, yes, sometimes. Consequentialism isn't always false. Sometimes you do consider the consequences of your actions as a guide for whether you should engage in those actions. Yeah. Next, a person said, there is a solution to the conundrum. Give up the nonsense that is religion. Become a humanist. Our moral code is consistent and beneficial to humankind. No dancing on the tips of needles. Unfortunately, this person just didn't, I think, even really understand what is being discussed in the video. It's not an issue of Christian doctrine per se. It's a general epistemological, ethical, and pedagogical question, which can be asked of anybody. This is how I put it in response to this person. I said, the issue being discussed is a token case. That is, the question of Christian doctrine here is a token case of a general question. Is it better that a person believe false proposition P, which enables them to believe a true proposition of greater theological, existential, social, or other import? Or should you bring it about that they disbelieve false proposition P, which will thereby potentially disable them from believing the true proposition of greater import? Now, here's to explain, in case that's hard to follow, here's a simple example that isn't related to Christian doctrine. Let's say that Jane has had a hard life and has been disappointed by countless people, but the one person she always looked up to in her life as a moral paragon, a lighthouse of virtue, was her father. Her father has since died, and you know that her father was in fact a schmuck. He was an immoral person, but he was good to Jane. Should you go to Jane now, and let me just add maybe one more thing. It's also highly unlikely that Jane will learn the true character of her father unless you go and share that information with her. Should you now go and disabuse her of her beliefs about the moral virtue of her father and give her a true belief that her father was in fact a bad person? Should you tell her that, knowing that that will potentially undermine her last hope of faith in humanity itself? Or should you allow Jane to continue to hold the false belief that her father was in fact a good and virtuous person, knowing that allowing her to believe that will continue to keep on the pilot light of her faith in humanity? That's a very practical example of what I was talking about with respect to Christian doctrine. Okay, so it's a question that we all ask. Humanists ask the question too. It's not a tribal religious issue at play here. Finally, I want to consider two concrete examples, in addition to the one I shared in the last video. The last one was about open theism. Here, the first example I want to give to illustrate the wisdom of the principle comes from John Piper. And here, I'm going to quote from my own book, Jesus Loves Canaanites, pages 71 to 72, where I give this example from John Piper. So, quoting myself, in a debate over the question of Calvinism versus Arminianism, Arminian theologian Thomas McCall raises his own moral objections to the Calvinist concept of God. In response, his interlocutor, Calvinist John Piper, offered the following bit of advice, quote, "Do not yet believe what I say. Your conscience forbids it. You dare not believe statements about God which, according to your own conscience, can only mean that God is what he is not," unquote. It's important to appreciate the ground of Piper's caution. If we violate our most basic moral intuitions by denying our conscience, it will surely produce an even deeper distortion in our theology down the line. So what Piper was doing here, and I think it is extraordinary and it deserves a spotlight, he was telling Tom McCall, do not accept Calvinism, because based upon some other beliefs you have, if you accept the Calvinist view of election and meticulous divine providence, it will potentially lead you to believe that God is in fact a moral monster. So you should continue to be an Arminian, even though I, as a Piperian Calvinist, believe Arminianism is false. because if you reject Arminianism and believe Calvinism, there is a high likelihood that you will come to believe something even more false than Arminianism. That is Piper's advice to Arminian Tom McCall. So what I'm arguing in the previous video is nothing different than what Piper says here to Tom McCall. The second example I'm going to give, and then we'll wrap up this little video, is from Dennis Lamrou. Now, I interviewed Dennis Lamrou in a two-part interview this week. If you haven't watched that yet, I really think you need to. I'd just like to point out he's got 3 doctorates, one in dentistry, one in evolutionary biology, and one in theology. He understands the issues of creationism and evolution as well as anybody. He is an evolutionary creationist. He believed God created through evolutionary processes. But one of the things that Lamrou will always say is that if he knows of a person who's a young earth creationist and the issue is not going to become a serious one for them, like, let me give 2 examples. So you have 2 young earth creationists, let's say Jones and Smith. Jones is an 18-year-old young earth creationist who's about to go off to university and study biology. Dennis Lamrou knows that Jones is about to have his young earth creationist beliefs severely challenged, and as a result, potentially have his commitment to Christianity itself severely challenged, because Jones has been led to believe the two are inextricably intertwined. So then when young earth creationism is potentially undermined, Christianity could potentially be undermined as well. And in that case, Dr. Lamrou will surely teach Jones about why he is an evolutionary creationist and why, in fact, young earth creationism and Christianity are not inextricably intertwined. And that's a conversation definitely worth having. But then you have Smith. Let's say Smith is a 60-year-old grandmother who goes to church, who's been a young earth creationist all her life, perfectly content. Evolution is not going to be creating any crisis of faith for her in the next 10, 20 years, however long she shall remain in this mortal coil. Dennis Lamrou is not going to seek out Smith and say, you really need to come to terms with evolution, because it's just not going to be an issue for her. So it's a matter of having discernment as to where you share these beliefs and where it is worthwhile or even necessary to disabuse people of false beliefs, and where it just doesn't matter that much. Again, that's what I'm talking about in the previous video.